Hello, and welcome to OARC 36. Could someone just confirm that they can see and hear me on my slides, please?
I can see you, I can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Keith Mitchell. I'm OARC President, and welcome to OARC 36. Before we start the workshop, I just want to share with you a little bit of workshop logistic information, and then for those of you who are not familiar with DNS-OARC already, a brief introduction to our organization. So this is an online event. We had I have a code of conduct policy, which you signed up to either when you registered for the event or as an OARC member. It's there to ensure that everyone has a good experience. So please make sure that you're familiar with the contents of that and respect that and your other attendees. The workshop is being recorded, so the video, as usual, will be available a few weeks after the event. We're in Zoom webinar format. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that by now. So non-speakers are muted during the event. We're doing all event times in UTC, although you probably guessed that we're kind of European time zone for this. Social media hashtags, please feel free to post about the event on #LoveDNS and #OARC36. If you haven't already signed up for a Mattermost chat platform, I strongly recommend that you do to get the best workshop participation experience. There is the workshop channel in the community team, which is where the default discussion and comments about the workshop will happen. Note that if you have a question for a speaker, that's not the place to do it. It won't be monitored for that. You can publicly sign. You can sign up anyone can sign up at chat.dnsoarc.net, and there are clients for just about every platform, or you can use your web browser to access it. If you do have questions for the speakers, there's a slot of about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each speaker session. Each speaker's presentation slot. If you want to speak your question, then raise your hand in Zoom, and the session chair will then, when it's your turn to talk, they will ask you to unmute, then need to unmute and speak your question. If you prefer to type your question, use the Zoom question and answer panel. It will be read out by the session chair in turn. Obviously, this is all subject to time permitting, and we'll try and do it first come, first served basis as much as possible. And for the benefits of everybody else in the webcast, please identify yourself and your affiliation when asking. In terms of feedback for presentation, we very much appreciate this. We'll be doing that via Zoom poll again. During the Q&A session at the end of each talk, there will be the Q&A, the feedback voting panel will show up. So please, that's your only chance to comment on that particular talk. So please vote when you can. And the program committee finds that really helpful. We can compare the scores from the audience against the scores in their internal review process and make sure that we're giving you the content that you want. As ever, we're interested in feedback on general meeting logistics and other aspects, and there will be a survey available that you can use to do that. So that covers the meeting logistic information, I'll now share with you, for those of you who are not already familiar with OARC, a little bit of information about our organization and what we've been doing lately. What is our mission? Our mission is to make the internet's DNS work better. There's a bunch of ways that we do that, importantly through cooperation between operators and researchers, including data sharing, generating useful tools, testers, and open source software that is usable. It's about relationship building, and these workshops are very much a part of our mission and how we implement that. We have a very diverse set of members. It includes some very large organizations and some very small ones, CCTLD and GTLD, registries, registrars, internet providers, vendors of software, both open source and in appliance form, and many of the large cloud providers and content providers and CDN operators. So we have over 100 participants. If you're interested in becoming a member, we'd love to have you as part of our community. So what have we achieved this year? We took on a lot of funded development work last year for generating open source software. We completed most of that, or we completed all of that during 2021. The most notable being the addition of DOH capability to our DNS performance testing tool. That was funded by the Comcast Community Grants Fund and Mozilla OSS. And we also added RPKI origin validation to our Check My DNS tester. That was funded by Aaron. So thank you to all our donors. It's not just these three organizations. You can find a list of all the organizations that have contributed to our work over the past couple of years at that webpage. This is our fourth workshop of the year. We did a very brief one over the summer, but the workshops have been well attended, and we've certainly had some excellent content. Personal goal of mine, which has taken a while to achieve, is we exceeded 1 million revenue. We haven't spent it all as well, which is also good, up to a point. We completed our annual day in the life of the internet data collection. So that data is now available to our members and researchers. On our systems front, the work is never done, but there's been significant progress on cleaning up and automating so that our infrastructure is more scalable. The other thing that Matter Systems Engineer has been working on and is nearly completed is our new Ceph data store. The hardware and software are ready. It's just a case of bringing it online, and we hope we'll complete that around the end of the year. Many of you have already had contact with our new membership coordinator, Steve Sullivan. Steve is online and available to take your comments during the workshop and help you out. There's been some interesting outages in which the DNS was, well, blamed to some extent, which was perhaps not the same as the extent to which it was responsible. But it's been great to see the community come together during these outages and use some of the platforms that we have available to try and mitigate and resolve these issues. And indeed, we have a talk about that later on. Jeremy has been doing some learning sessions, the DSC Grafana crash course, how to make use of our domain statistics collector open source software together with Grafana to present telemetry from your DNS platforms. The next talk is going to be about the progress that the privacy committee has made, including a charter to better define their mission. Despite all the challenges that the pandemic has brought to all aspects of all life, we have maintained operational continuity. So I don't regard that as a small thing. Our technical resources are largely unchanged. As I say, the data store is very nearly live. Our core infrastructure in Fremont, California has been humming along pretty nicely, despite the fact that we haven't been able to visit it as often as we would like. If you want to find more about the various open source tools that we have, there you can look at that website. We run various DNS testers, and we have a couple of secondary sites in Ottawa and Stockholm provided by two of our members to help diversify our infrastructure. And we've just done a server upgrade in Stockholm. If you're interested in becoming an OARC member and you're not already, there are a range of membership categories depending on the size of your organization. There are a couple of entry-level categories which have additional criteria other than just money for joining. Steve will be very happy to talk to you if you're interested in joining or indeed upgrading if you're an existing member. A little bit about how we operate at OARC. I consider it best of breed as far as this type of organization in our space is concerned. We are a not-profit neutral membership organization. We have an independent legal entity. Our member base is very diverse. We succeed in actually being non-profit as opposed to running on a deficit basis. We're self-governed by the board being elected by the members. All our staff are contracted, and a lot of how we operate is contributed by volunteers, and the most notable committees being the program committee that generates the content for these workshops, the privacy committee, and lots of other people who help out as part of our crew. Formally, we have 501c3 federal nonprofit status in the US where we're incorporated. A month ago, we had our annual general meeting. I'm pleased to welcome two new board members. I'm sure they will be familiar to many of you in the industry. Ray Bellis from ISC and Joel Damas from APNIC, and the four existing board members continue to serve. Staff, as I said, one change there. We're sorry to see Sue Graves go, but we're very welcome to see Steve join the team. And we'd really like to hire some more people. It's a challenging hiring environment, so we haven't succeeded in doing that this year. But ideally, we like another couple of engineers and an office administrator So if you're interested in any of these positions or know anybody or would be willing to spread the word, we'd very much appreciate that. Program committee. One of the first things that the board does once it's elected is to select the following calendar year program committee. I think that the 2021 program committee has done an awesome job, so I'm very pleased to see that 4 of them will be continuing. 2 were term limited, so we have 3 new members. I'd like to welcome Hazel Smith, John Todd from Quad 9, and Suzanne Wolf. One of these is still subject to employer verification, but they will be hitting the ground very shortly to generate the program for the next workshop and for 2022. And I'd like to thank the various people who have made considerable service to OARC, in particular Andre Suri, who served 5 years on the board, and Joe Abley, who served 1 year on the board, but would have served longer if circumstances had permitted. A special thank you to Jan Blecak, who served 3 years on the PC and the past year as its chair. Jake Zach has also served 3 years in the PC, and Brett Carr. At this point, we would have a nice round of applause. If this was a physical meeting, Zoom isn't really very good for that, but I hope you will join me in thanking them all for what they have done for OARC, and I hope we'll be able to show that appreciation more tangibly when we return to physical meetings. So what are we doing in terms of returning to physical meetings? Well, this slide was done before Thursday's Omicron news, so everything is subject to how the pandemic unfolds. But it remains our plan to have a hybrid workshop for OARC 37 in February. We realize a lot of people will not be able to attend or will not feel safe attending, so we will certainly be supporting an online element to that. We hope that we will be able to do a physical element as well. Dinesh and I are doing a site visit to Austin next week, in which we will be gathering a lot of information so that we can then be very clear about what precautions we will put in place, what is feasible, what's not feasible. If we can't do a physical meeting, then we will fall back to an online one just like this one. But we should have the call for presentation, registration, and exactly what we'll be doing in terms of pandemic precautions announced no later than early January. And then for later in the year, we hope to get back to co-locating the May workshop with the ICANN IDS workshop for OARC 38, and in the autumn, OARC 39 co-locating with RIPE 85 and Center Tech. So why become an OARC member? I hope that the next couple of days' content will convince you that this is the world's premier community of DNS technical experts. There's a chance, if you're a member, to influence what tools and services we develop. You have access to our unique data set, access to community coordination resources when incidents happen, and very much because OARC is a neutral party which is free of vested interest in the DNS space. I won't bash on about it more, but just to share with you some of the testimonials that we've had from members recently about how they find value in the organization. And that is all I have to say for this workshop. It's time to hand over to the people who will deliver the actual content for you. The first thing I'd like to do is to thank VeriSign as a sponsor for this workshop and indeed all our workshops this year. And then I will hand you over to Dan Blecak, who will be doing the session chair for today's sessions, and from Ulrich Wisser, who will be acting as timekeeper.
Thank you, Keith. So hello, everyone. My name is Jan Blecak. I'm on a PC, as was said, and I'm being joined by Ulrich, who is going to make sure that our speakers will stay on time. And before we kick it off with the first presentation, I will actually remind you that we have a call for presentations still open for lightning talks at the end of the second day. There's some time reserved for lightning talks. We got 1 submission so far, and I think we should be able to accept 2 or 3 more. So if you have some interesting topic that can be shared in 5 to 10 minutes, please send in your proposal today, and we will decide what will fit the agenda before the day 2 starts. And with that, I would like to invite Benno Overeinder to our virtual stage, and he will be presenting our first topic. He will give us a report on DNS-OARC Privacy Committee. So Benno, I can see your screen, but I cannot see you nor hear you.
Okay, yeah.
And I can hear you. Awesome, you're good to go.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. Welcome. So my name is Benno Overeinder. I'm doing this presentation together with Sarah Dickinson. Sarah did most of the work, so all credits to Sarah, and all errors are credited to myself. Good. Let's see, sorry. Oh. Yeah, there we go. So the DNS Privacy Committee and our survey we were running. So let's get some context here. So OARC, so Operations Analysis and Research Center, actually encourages the collection of data. So and the data is made available to the researchers for analysis and publication. So, and by enabling by enabling this research analysis, it contributes, as Keith just mentioned with the introduction of OARC, it really contributes to the mission of OARC. So it's an important part of OARC is the collection of data and making this data available to researchers. And maybe unknown to most of the people here in the room, in the virtual room, is that with the membership, there's also a data sharing agreement. It's an annex to the membership, and the organization signed for that. And that sets a number of requirements to either contribute data or use data for the researchers. And currently, we are reviewing this data sharing agreement in the light of the European GDPR or the Californian Customer Privacy Act. So, and with that, with this review, if it's still all the legal, it's within the legal regulations. Sorry, how OARC offers data to its members, to the users. It gives also an opportunity to evaluate how the members are using, the users are using the data storage. Is there room for improvement? How many people are using the data? Is there flexibility, etc., etc. So this is kind of the context of our work as the privacy committee. So to get this to start this evaluation, we are running a survey. So during the AGM last month, we announced that we will run a survey. We shared the link on 2-3 OARC mailing lists to ask the community to fill in the survey. And it consists of 2 parts: one for the contributing data, so the organizations contributing the data, and the second part, individual users using data for analysis. We did run it for 2 weeks until last week. We got 16 responses, so 5 responses for contributing data and 11 for using data. So we know that 21 organizations are contributing data for OARC, but we don't know how many users we have in the past using OARC data. So we don't know how large this sample set is. So with all the results, we have a relatively small sample set, but it's a good start, and I'm looking forward to a discussion with you in the room and with the community at large. So first, going to the organizations that do contribute data. So what are the concerns with the current data sharing agreement? And also about anonymizing data, so the privacy concern. So 2 out of 5 organizations are modifying anonymizing data. The others are contributing raw data to the data set. Another question we had is, what are your major concerns with the current data sharing agreement? And of course, it's the compliance with the data protection. That's important. There's the GDPR or the CCPA. But also, and we didn't ask explicitly for that, there's one has a concern with the future use of data of cloud storage. So that's something we have to discuss in more detail here. So what are the blockers for these organizations? Looking into the future, so what changes do the current data sharing agreement would encourage future contribution? And again, there's some flexibility here. So where to store the data, either on the OARC or on OARC servers on the cloud servers would be improvement to them, but also how the data is used, because that's also being considered important. Not only contributing data, but you want to have users that use this data you contribute. And there's also mentioned is, for example, anonymized data temporary in the cloud for analysis, and then is being removed again. These are opportunities also for the community. So again, it's called a limited conclusion. So flexibility, increased flexibility seems to be useful for the data contributors. Good. So organizations that do not contribute. So what are their concerns? Well, of course, the GDPR, the CCPA compliance is important. But also, and we have highlighted it in blue. So a concern is future cloud of storage. So it's kind of a negative result. So none of them call that being blocker. So that's an opportunity in that respect. That's why we highlight it here. And also here, what changes do the DSA would cause future contribution? Again, there's the flexibility. Yeah? So where can we? So how data can be used temporarily in the cloud, anonymized data, so that users can use it from different places. There's more detail in the raw data in the survey. We can publish that later, but we skip that for time considerations. So again, the limited conclusion here is that data compliance issue, but flexibility to increase data usage is very useful. Good. The individuals that access and use data for the analysis, for the study. So we asked the individuals, the users, so what kind of data out of the data sets OARC has, they use. And one of the most important data sets is, mostly used data sets is DITL. It's a day in the life of DNS. That's far out the most important. We also ask how often data is being used by the researchers. That's just 50-50 monthly or 1 or 2 times a year. And also quite often, so item 3, data is derived from raw data and being used in papers published and shared with other researchers. 5. That's item 4. So it's important also for our research community, the data sets. Yeah, okay, this is already said. Again, we ask also the users, how easy is it to access data and use the data for the analysis? And that's kind of evenly distributed around average. And there's certainly room for improvement here. That might be clear. Also, again, we looked into what are the specific barriers, blockers for users. And the one I want to highlight here out of all of them is the limited access, so OARC-only service, again, and the limited resource to process data. It's also on the OARC service. So if people here not familiar with the OARC data sets, they are stored on the OARC services and can only be analyzed on the OARC service. That's part of the data sharing agreement. And only derived data is allowed to move after review by a board, to move from the OARC service to your own server and being used in scientific papers or research papers. So that seems to be one of the 2 largest blockers: limited access and limited resources. So we call it the analysis environment is highly constrained. That's one of the conclusions. How do I time-wise, Jan?
You're good. I think we have 2 minutes before questions.
Okay, excellent. I will speed up a bit, but I'm fine. So this is about anonymization. I will go a little bit faster here. So full anonymization seems to be a blocker for the researchers, but pseudo anonymization with some with some limits. So it's the second bullet point. Only the 24 the /24, and there's a one-to-one map from real to anonymous IP. The data set is still useful. So there's certainly room for pseudo-anonymization, and that it's still a good data set for researchers. Access, what are the blockers for individuals that do not use the OARC data yet? Well, again, access is difficult to arrange, so the flexibility to access, and processing is too slow, so the limited resource actually available to the researchers. So coming to the key conclusions here. Again, it's a small set for the data. The organizations contributing data. It's 5 out of 21. So the conclusion can be said, well, there's the data compliance is an issue, but we're looking into that. That's one of the tasks of the privacy committee. And there's no strong objections in providing more flexibility in storage and access methods to the users. So that's good. That gives us opportunities. And on the data access and usage, again, it's a small set, 11 out of, we don't know how large this set is. But the main thing is here that they feel limited by the current access model, and providing more processing resources would be good, and also describing the data better so that the researchers know which data is available and how to use that. Again, this runs into our actions and next steps. Of course, we would like to have more responses from the community. We can come back to that later. We will reach out to the 21 organizations contributing data, so we get more complete view of the organizations contributing data. And in discussion and dialogue with the community, we want to create a data catalog describing the data, and actively review ways to to lower the barrier to access data and analyze data. And we also would generate a report for discussion. It's a brief update, but I hope we still have some minutes for discussion and questions. Okay, I will leave up this for the audience. Maybe that triggers some questions from the audience. Otherwise, I have some questions.
Thank you, Ben. Awesome. So please send in your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. I will read the questions for Benno. In the meantime, there should be a poll showing up on your screens where you can rate this presentation. And also, if you want to ask your question in words without typing them, please raise your hand and I will allow you to speak. So we don't have any questions so far written in.
No.
I'm checking if someone wants to ask questions.
So in the meantime, I'm happy to hear any experience from the researchers in the room, so in the audience, what went well, what could be improved, and also think, some of the researchers, can they share positive or good experience with other external data sets? So not their own data sets, but other external data sets they have used for research papers. So we can learn from that. And we as a community and privacy committee specifically. Yeah.
Okay, so I see one question already by Rafael Summers. So Rafael, you should be able to ask your question.
Okay, so I've used actually the DNS-OARC dataset in 2 occasions. Once I used the zone file for top-level domain, and the other one zone file for root data. Things that I found most difficult to use was due to the fact that basically I need to analyze all the data on the DNS-OARC server. And the limit in there, it's not the processing power, like the tool available on the DNS-OARC server, but was more the fact that basically if I need to join the data with external data sources that then are under NDA, I cannot basically bring that external data sources to OARC, so I cannot join the data with OARC data, and that sort of creates a sort of barrier. So maybe a sort of mechanism where you can grant access to people that can process like data, like S3 packets or something similar, that people can process packet from external software, but not downloading effectively the data that will be useful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your feedback. Yeah. Are there other people? If we still have time, of course. We're a little running out of time, probably.
So
Sharing.
we might have a minute, one more minute. I don't see any further questions. And yeah, I also see that Sarah doesn't want to add any comment. So
okay.
Yeah, let's conclude this presentation. Thank you very much, Benno.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so please contact us if you have any questions or you want to contribute or give feedback on the data usage. It would be very worthwhile and useful for us. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Benno. And with that, I would like to invite our next speaker, who is Rafael from University of Twente, with his presentation, Characterization of Anycast Adoption in the DNS Authoritative Infrastructure. So Rafael, please share your slides, and I will just give you a quick confirmation that we can see it. I can see the slides.
Okay, great.
And I can hear you. Okay, you're good to go.
Okay, thanks. So good morning, everyone. I'm Raffaele Sommese, third year PhD student at the University of Twente. And today, basically, I want to present you this work that we published in a TMA conference this year. It's basically a characterization of Anycast adoption in the DNS authoritative infrastructure. This is a collaboration between us and the University of Twente, SIGN Labs, UC San Diego, and CADA. Let me start first a bit on the idea of the DNS. So DNS, basically, as most of you know, was originally designed to distribute, the design of DNS was originally designed to distribute load and responsibility among different servers. And the way that the resilience was archived in DNS was basically define multiple authoritative servers through multiple NS records to basically implement this resilience mechanism. Over time, there was another network layer mechanism that emerged that was EP Anycast. EP Anycast basically used the same IP address for geographical diverse server, geographical diverse instance, and it's a responsibility of the routing system to route basically the packet to the topologically closest replica. In case of failure, it's always responsibility of the internet routing process to reroute the packets to the other closest replica. What we see here is that compared to the original way that basically DNS worked with multiple NS records, the replica selection shifts from something that was an explicit choice from the resolver to something that is an implicit choice of the routing system of BGP routing. So this mechanism, however, was adopted accepted and adopted in the DNS community. Firstly, for overcoming basically the limitation of 13 root servers. In fact, Anycast was widely deployed and adopted among root server, but also in top-level domain authoritative name server. In 2013, there was a study that found that basically between 56 and 72% of top-level domain authoritative name server adopted Anycast. The idea of this work is basically to perform a new census of this adoption and also target second-level domain adoption. So the contribution that we give is basically investigate the top-level domain and second-level domain Anycast adoption, try to shed light basically on the changes between 2017 and 2021, and the reason why we use this to date because it's the data of the Anycast census that we had available. Analyze the reason why we see a sort of increase during the years of this Anycast adoption and compare this Anycast adoption across different top-level domains. and assessed basically implication of Anycast adoption for the other DNS resilience risk profiles. So the dataset that we use are the Overintel measurement data. It's a large-scale measurement project that we run here at the University of Twente that contains 187 million responsive domain across 153 top-level domain in the period of 2017-2021. We use the historical root zone file from DNS-OARC from 2017 to 2021, and we use one Anycast census that was performed in 2017 with the iGrid software by Chicales et al., and another Anycast census that we performed in 2021 with a similar methodology, with another software with a similar methodology. It's called Manica Square, and also iGrid software. So first result that we looked was this. We revisited this adoption of top-level domain, given the critical role that they play in the DNS hierarchy. The result that we obtained shows that basically from 2013 there was a large increase in terms of deployment in Anycast in top-level domain authoritative name servers. In 2017, 93% of top-level domain were using Anycast in whole or in part. That means that part of their server could be Anycast and part can be Unicast. And this percentage in 2021 reached the 97%. So almost all top-level domain authoritative name server nowadays are deployed on Anycast infrastructure. And also we see that this increase is mainly related to ccTLDs, so these that usually are smaller. So many ccTLDs moved from using Unicast to using Anycast. We also seen a clear expansion in terms of number of replicas per IP, so number of Anycast sites that were deployed for this authoritative name server. However, we found also some bad results, if we can call it that way. For example, the .kr, Kiribati top-level domains, which is for using fully Anycast setup or mixed setup. So instead of having old name server as Anycast name server, they start to include some name server as Unicast name server. And 3 ccTLDs that are Venezuela, Panama, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, switched basically from mixed Anycast to Unicast. The reason for Venezuela and Panama was related to the fact that they use a secondary authoritative name server provided by IC, the Internet System Consortium, that was shut down on 31 January of 2020. This was the only Anycast name server that they use. We also assessed basically the adoption of Anycast in second level domain. And we see that basically more than half of the responsive second-level domain that we see in our data, in the Overintel dataset, use Anycast for the deployment of their name server. Compared to 2017, there was like an increase of 11.7%. So also in second-level domain, the trend is increasing usage of Anycast in the authoritative infrastructure. And however, what we see is also that only 2.3% of the name server are Anycast. And this suggested us a sort of a concentration towards some Anycast provider. We looked to the fact if Anycast deployment implies a sort of concentration inside DNS, and we found that this the top 10 Anycast organization in 2017 and 2021 were responsible for 92% of the domain adopting Anycast. And this for Unicast is not the same, because for Unicast it's just the 63% of the top 10 responsible for the total number of Unicast deployments. And if we look to this top 10 basically of Anycast organization in 2017 and 2021, we see that GoDaddy alone accounted for half of the domain adopting Anycast. So GoDaddy was responsible for half of the domain in the global space of DNS for adopting Anycast. The other question that we ask ourselves is that if domain owners, if the choose of Anycast is something that domain owners choose, or it's something just that it's given by the fact that people register their domain names and use the service provided by the registrar. And what we see is basically that OVH, it's a popular European hosting provider, offer Anycast as an optional service. You need to pay €1.21 per year. And nearly all second-level domain using OVH operating infrastructure again use Unicast name server. We measure 4 million domain using OVH Unicast infrastructure and just 130,000 domain that were using Anycast. So if people need to pay for Anycast at the end, they will not use it, will not choose it as optional service. We also look to the role of registrar in Anycast adoption, in particular comparing the case of Sweden and Netherlands. We see that Sweden and Netherlands are two similar CCTLDs. However, we see a great difference in terms of adoption of Anycast. Sweden was really high and Netherlands was pretty low. And we looked to the reason, and basically the reason was that the most popular registrar in Sweden, .c.Sweden, it was Lupia that has adopted Anycast by default, where in .nl TransitP, that was the largest registrar, doesn't adopt Anycast. So basically the role of a registrar plays a fundamental role in the adoption, especially when we look to the small market like the one of CCTLDs. Last thing that we try to assess basically is the implication of Anycast adoption for the DNS risk profiles. So originally, with DNS, basically when the name server fails, it's the resolver, it's the responsibility of the resolver to check if there is another name server available. Instead, with Anycast, the resilience is not anymore explicit inside the DNS, but it's in the routing system. So Anycast hides this mechanism of the selection of another replica from the client. It's all in the routing system. Imagine a situation where all DNS entries for a specific domain point to the same IP or same /24. The resolution will rely entirely on Anycast. So if a server or subnet will fail silently, then basically everyone that's routed to that advertiser is effectively decoded. Or in case of an attack, for example, there could be like a part of the world that completely cannot reach a specific Anycast distance. We also look to the impact of Anycast on diversity, and we see that basically Anycast deployment tend to use algorithm server with Anycast deployment that use fewer IP addresses, given that basically they provide redundancy via the routing system, and usually also that Anycast deployment are concentrated towards single ASN. So domain that use Anycast tend to trust, for example, a single company that provides that Anycast service and not multiple company in using, for example, their DNS services. However, there is a good point that basically it's Anycast deployment tend to be usually more globally distributed. So the number of countries where these servers are deployed are wider than, for example, in Unicast deployments.
That was the timekeeper. You have 5 minutes left.
The things that basically we want to stress for Overeinder is try to do not use Anycast as a holy grail of resilience. And what I mean with that, we have this case of Lupia. Lupia serve around 5,000 domain names Anycast, and they serve it from a single /24. So all these domains were routed from a single /24. /24 is the minimum prefix that you can announce on the global BGP routing system. That means that it's the minimum prefix that you can announce for an Anycast network. That means that that network is the only Anycast network that they have. If all this network will fail for some reason, given that Lupia relies as only resilience mechanism uniquely on Anycast, basically all the server of Lupia will be offline. Because the network will fail, for example, for a misconfiguration of the operators, everything will not work anymore, because that's the only resilience mechanism that they put in place. And the same somehow applies also to 101 Jonas.c that was responsible for 6.8 million domain, and where we see basically that they announced their Anycast network from a single routed /22 block, and we see that this block was single routed from the RIPE RIS announcement. So basically, to conclude a bit this overview, we found that basically there is a high adoption of Anycast as a resilience mechanism, and this adoption reached 97% of top-level domain and 62% of second-level domain in 2021. However, this adoption is mostly done by it's mostly driven by engineering choice of very few large DNS infrastructure providers. So it's not the choice of the user, but it's the choice of DNS providers that decide to adopt Anycast, and it's not something that users want to choose. Also, that we see that Anycast adoption changed the way that DNS can fail, and sometimes make it worse, because make it the failure of DNS completely separate from DNS original resilience mechanism. The future work that we want to perform from here will be try to characterize the resilience of Anycast and Unicast and mixed deployment under attack, and try to understand what is the implication for performance metrics of Anycast deployment, such as, for example, the resolution latency for the Anycast deployment or Unicast deployment. And this basically concludes my talk. And if you have any question, you are welcome to answer that. I'm welcome to answer that.
Thank you, Rafael. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And yes, again, Paul should show up on your screens where you can read this presentation. And in the meantime, you can also fill in the questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. I don't see any questions flowing in. If you want to ask questions vocally, please raise your hand. There's a button for that as well. So we have a first question here. How did you verify? It's a question by Walter De Vries. How did you verify that the name server is anycasted?
Okay, for 2017 we rely on Anycast census that was performed at this methodology that's iGreedy. That basically use the speed of light violation by performing probes, by performing basically ICMP measurement with dry pathless probes. So the idea was that they try to ping an address from different geographical location in the world. If the round trip time for that address violates the speed of light, that means that that address should it's Anycast because it should have two instances in different parts of the world. And they published a dataset in 2017, and we used that dataset for the 2021. We did the first analysis with the software that we developed. It's called the Anycast-OARC. Basically relies on the idea of using Anycast to measure Anycast. We send probe from Anycast IPs, and we try to check if we receive a multiple location. That it's an indication that the answering IP is Anycast. And then we refine with the same methodology of 2017. So it's basically a mixed approach to one of 2021. But yeah, it's a census basically on the entire IPv4 space that we publish online. And we joined that with DNS data.
Okay, thank you. And we have two more questions, and then we will. We have two more questions, and we will have to finish before we break. So the first question is asked by Gavin McCulloch. Did you investigate any of the limitations on use of Anycast globally as a reason not to use it? My understanding is there are some countries within which authorities do not allow advertisement of a global Anycasted IP range.
So yes, I mean we have seen that, for example, we have limited visibility in Anycast deployment of specific country. This was not actually related to this or this work, but work before the one where we basically assessed the we did the census of Anycast in the global IPv4 space. We have limited visibility for some countries, but that's more related to the fact that this country have different BGP connectivities to the world, I mean, different way that they approach BGP connectivity to the world, for example, to China. And that's challenging to address. For some cases, we basically don't address that kind of limit. We just accept that as a limitation.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is asked by Vinotu Kumar Prabhakaran. Sorry if I mispronounced the name. What are the risks associated with Anycast adoption?
One of the risks it's this one. It's to trust only Anycast. I mean, Anycast per se, it's a really good technology for the deployment, for deploying resilient service. It's that the traditional resilience mechanism of DNS, so deploying name server in different SN, deploying name server in different geographical location, different IPv4 space, should be kept running. I mean, they should not just rely, we implemented Anycast and that's it. That's the message that we found.
Okay, thank you, Rafael. Thank you for your contribution. And
thank you.
With that, we will take a short break. We have 11 minutes, I guess. and we will start at 15 UTC sharp with our next presentation. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We are about to start, and in this session block, we'll have 3 presentations, and then the day 1 will be wrapped up by Keith. And our first speaker in the session is Deccio from Birmingham Young University, and his presentation is called Advertising DNS Protocol Used to Mitigate DDoS Attacks. So Casey, if you can share your screen, I can see it.
All right, you're seeing things and hearing me?
Yes, very well. Thank you. You're good to go.
Perfect. All right. Well, as was said, my name is Deccio, and this research was done with one of my graduate students who recently graduated and is now working at Sandia National Laboratories, and I'm currently working at Brigham Young University. So to set the stage for this is just a brief recap of the roles in the DNS. We have 2 client-server pairs. Of course, we have typically the stub to the recursive resolver, with the stub making queries there, and then we have the recursive resolver contacting the various authoritative servers to track down a given answer following referrals and so forth. Now, typically, as we know, the DNS runs over UDP. Of course, there are some standards in place, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but supporting UDP continues to be something that for the foreseeable future. And one of the problems with that is the lack of identity management with UDP alone. And so we have, for example, an attack where you would send something, well, we have 2 types of attacks in terms of identity. And one of them is cache poisoning, where the victim doesn't know an attacker impersonates the identity of the server and is able to trick a victim into putting something into its cache that is invalid. And on the other side of things, we have an attacker that is spoofing a packet claiming to be from the victim and making servers, maybe thousands of servers, return these unsolicited responses to victims and overwhelming them. And of course, we know this is a denial of service via reflection and amplification type attack. So those are just 2 examples of where identity management really matters in the DNS. Now, we have some existing security protocols that help with that, with the identity management. So first of all, in this first bullet, we talk about DNS over TCP. And I don't know that anyone's doing this in particular, but there is the idea that what if you did just DNS over TCP only, okay? And so that you could actually say, hey, we just want the identity management that goes along with this, and so we're going to use TCP only. DNS cookies is sort of a lighter weight way of doing identity management that allows the client and server to mutually authenticate using cookies, using a secret that only the other one knows effectively. We also are familiar and becoming more familiar with DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, which provide encryption as well as the identity management between the 2, the client server parties. And then we have DNSSEC, which can help at least on the cache poisoning model for origin authentication. The problem is that none of these by themselves prevents a denial of service attack, in the sense that if a DNS server X receives a UDP query, it's going to respond to that source. And what we don't have right now, because we have to support this quote unquote least secure option of UDP, we don't know what the victim should be supporting in terms of like, oh, well, you should have supported, we know that you should have supported DNS cookies, so we're not actually going to return that. Right now, we have to assume that it didn't, and that we return things over this least secure option if queried from UDP. So we're going to introduce something here to help with enforcement of some of these secure protocols, and we focus on DNS cookies as our primary use case, but really could apply to any one of these. And so we call this the DNS Protocol Advertisement Records, or DPAR. And the goal is to protect the clients, the would-be victims, in sort of a 2-step process. So they sort of have to upgrade the protocol that they use, and then they create an advertisement record. And I guess the third step is for a server to actually check that. So it might be DNS cookies, it might be TCP. And again, the goal is to help the identity management in terms of a would-be DDoS via reflection. So let's talk a little bit about how that works. So our initial idea for specification comes in posting policies in the reverse DNS. And so we have, for example, in the IPv4 world, we have on the right an example of what the tree might look like, where we have ARPA and inadder, and then working our way downward in the 10 dot tree. And so you might say, hey, in ARPA, 4.10.inadder.arpa, we would throw in a dpar record there. And we'll explain to you what this means here in just a minute, but there's a way to basically say, hey, at the /16 level for IPv4 and with possible optional delegation, you insert this policy at this location. And there are, with our specification, this initial draft, we would put in UDP acts as the default, where that's sort of the lowest bar of entry. And it basically means, hey, things are exactly the way they are. We don't have any more secure options. None is actually a special option, which means that if you receive a query from this given subnet, this prefix space, then you can say, hey, wait a minute, there wasn't supposed to be any DNS requests coming from this given location. And it says so right here in the DNS. So therefore, we shouldn't answer any of these queries. The other options that aren't shown here are TCP, if you wanted to specify that you should be receiving things from TCP only if they come from a given address space, or cookie, which means that you should receive things over, you should be expecting cookies in your UDP packets. Okay, and again, I mentioned that you would have these at a /16 and a /24 rather than guessing any given level. That's especially important for the IPv6 world. We have those at two different locations, the /40 and the /48, rather than going down the different nibbles. We'll talk about the reasons behind those in just a minute. So the idea behind it then is this. Okay, so you for a given server, it has an incoming query, and you check the client associated with that incoming query. Okay, and if you have something in your cache for that record, then you'll apply that policy that's associated with that record that you have. Otherwise, you'll queue the query, and we actually have a provision in there that says, hey, answer so many queries while the lookup of this policy is pending. But if it turns out there is no policy for a given prefix for which this client is associated, then you'll use a default policy, which is basically the same as it is now. That is, we accept from anyone. So the question is, if the query does conform to policy, then we just respond like normal. If not, we drop the packet. And now we actually have the teeth to do it because we see what the client advertised. To be clear, the client IP address space, what was advertised in terms of what should be expected by a server that's receiving an incoming query from there. But it does require the authoritative servers to perform some DNS queries, maybe not themselves, but at least to use a recursive resolver to do that for them. We did think about a few other alternative designs. So one of them, which I sort of mentioned in passing, was the idea that, well, what if you had something at any given IPv4 subnet level, you know, at the /8, /16, /24, but doing that really increases the effort for a server to find, you know, sort of going back and forth. So we made two definitive places. You go to the /16 and with possible delegation to the /24. That's and for IPv6 is similar to the /40 and /48. Having another alternative design is letting the server infer the client protocol by just seeing what they do. And there's a couple shortcomings with that. One is that an attacker could actually send spoof queries to make it look like the client has a certain lower level to match the server's expectations. The server will still you know, do whatever malicious things it would. It's effectively a downgrade attack. And the other thing is, it may not be that there's actually a client on the other end. This may be address space that doesn't have a DNS client. So you may never see anything from that address space until the attack begins. And that addresses this third bullet point as well. Having clients advertise support in their query does not actually protect them because you may not have ever communicated with that client. So you need to have some assertion from the client address space that this is what the client actually supports. So we wanted to actually dig into this a little bit and see how feasible this is on the administrative side. Looking at prefixes and for example, given a /16 or a /24 prefix, how much that's really that given address space is announced by different autonomous systems. That was a heuristic we used to determine, hey, how much would you have to coordinate efforts of a given policy if multiple organizations were involved in determining that policy, since we only have granularity at the /16 and /24 level. So what we did is we looked at the advertised prefixes using a recent look at announcements, and on average, what we found was that a /16 had about 8.4 prefixes, so roughly 8 organizations using our heuristic that might be sharing that /16 address space, and so it would, coordination might have to be managed there at the /16 level, possibly across those 8 organizations. And in terms of IPv6, we found that 74% of IPv6/40s have only one prefix announcement. So that's good. That makes it a lot easier to coordinate on that end. And in terms of thinking about that cutoff there, we found that most autonomous systems, because of announcing a larger prefix size or a shorter prefix length, most autonomous systems require at most 4 records. And then 10% of IPv6 autonomous systems would require a larger number of records to sort of cover their bases at the /40 level. But again, all these can go down to the /24 level, at which level there's much less coordination required, because as you can see on the chart on the right, once you get to /24, there's hardly any sharing. Okay, so we wanted to look at what the policy might be adopted at these different levels, given the way things are right now. And so this is where we use the diddle data. And by the way, to sort of refer back to Benno's excellent talk about diddle data, we were one of the survey respondents. And for us, it's actually really, really important to have de-anonymized data so we can understand not only what we're seeing at the root level, but associate it with different regions and diversity of client IP addresses and so forth. So we can actually see, do we have great deployment of this technology here, or is it evenly distributed, things like that. So just to put sort of a plug in there for how one way that we use the data that's actually very important to looking at deployment of different protocols. So, okay, so this is the data that we use. We found that 42% of /16s and nearly all of /40s, and again, that's in the IPv4, IPv6 world respectively, have no querying IP at all, according to the diddle data in that capture, and can adopt, therefore, a none policy. So this is sort of similar if you're familiar with SPF in the email world, again, that just says, hey, you shouldn't be seeing any queries from us. And that protects the victim, because the server, if they're doing their job, should then just drop any queries coming from these spaces. 47% of the remaining /16s, so everything else, have a dominant policy of none, meaning that in most cases there are most of their IP addresses, when considering all the /24s within them, most of those /24 subnets have no querying IP addresses. So you could actually put a policy at that /16 of none, and then delegate further down to say, oh, by the way, there's an exception. So this is still looking at sort of how complicated this might be to deploy. In this case, you can just say, well, keep the policy, the default policy of none, and then make exceptions to it, the /24. Okay, and then we looked at sort of what it might on average take to delegate further down from the /16 level to the /24, or the /40 to the /48. And we found that the average delegations that would be needed given the current landscape are 57 for IPv4 and 3.4, so very few for IPv6. And then we calculated given the entire space, this must include both IPv4 and IPv6, but I have to go back and check. About 2.3 million records overall for all the IP addresses. So just some sample numbers. And this is just to sort of see the exceptions, given, hey, if we had this given policy to /16, how many exceptions would we have? So again, in 83% of /24s overall would use none, meaning we have no clients that are issuing DNS queries. And almost all of /48s would have a default policy of none. And in 35% and 59% for IPv4 and IPv6 respectively, they have just a single client. So there is no discrepancy between what's the preferred secure protocol. And then when you look at when you have multiple clients, so there actually has to be some decisions made. Only 10% of /24s and 6% of 48s don't have a favorite, meaning some sort of dominant protocol. They're sort of equally, you see some sort of equal representation of UDP only versus UDP with cookies or something like that. That's again given the current diddle data, and so that's where we sort of had to say, well, it's not really clear what you might do, but we hope you just upgrade your policy and do the more secure one. Okay, now thinking about server adoption, and we know we have a lot of developers and operators on the authoritative side. We took some liberties with speculation here, but because of course it requires both the client side, or I should say the potential victim IP address space to be published, and we think that's actually not a problem because the victims would want to be protected. But it's the authoritative servers and potentially the recursive servers that would want to that would need to be relied upon to implement this on that side. And just some numbers out here from previous research: 3.7% of authoritative servers produce the largest amplification. So if we could at least target these ones, this 3.7%, this could potentially reduce the overall amplification from 40 times to 6 times. And so a significant reduction, even if we had just these high contributors implementing something like this.
This is your timekeeper. You have 3 minutes to Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much. Obviously, support by major software could really lead to adoption. If 30% of servers performed enforcement, the attack volume would be reduced on average. We're missing the number there. I'm sorry. You have to find that in our paper maybe. But we'll have to take it would take a significant effort to determine if a server is using enforcement. That's those of you that are more familiar with the authoritative server software will have a better idea of how to do that efficiently in the server software. Okay. I am going to, I'll briefly go over just the bottom bullets here out of sake of time. So we just did an analysis of BYU, my employer, our authoritative server data. We shows about queries from about 15,000 IP addresses per day, which means we would be doing that many lookups. And it would take about 1,000 to 5,000 queries is all to do that. And given the the recursive resolver volume, sorry, I can't talk, recursive resolver server volume, we're performing about 8.6 million queries in 12 hours. We think that's completely doable, if the authoritative server to offload that. I'm going to, out of sake of time, I'm going to skip this slide. And just to show some of the limitations, we have a few things left undefined. We don't have an official draft at this point. Like how long do you cache things with TTL, et cetera. We've only analyzed this so far with our own authoritative server data. It would take, looking at third-party data, especially from big names to see how feasible this is and what other tweaks might need to be made. And of course, we need other testing. And so we're continuing to do development. We would look forward to, if anyone has any contributions, either volunteer contributions or even monetary contributions to support this work, that would be grateful to support the students that are working on this. So in short, DNS is vulnerable, at least traditional DNS, to identity management. We have things like cookies and DOH, but they currently cannot be enforced as to say, hey, we must respect that this is what you support. And so we proposed DNS protocol advertisement records, or DPAR, to allow subnets to state the protocol, the most secure protocol that they support. And we've talked about some of that protocol. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to send us email to either Jacob or myself. And here are our email addresses. I will leave the slides up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. So we actually have a few questions already submitted. I see 4, so, and more are coming. So yeah, as I will be reading questions, the poll should pop up on your screen again. Please give some feedback to the program committee and to Casey. And I will just start reading the questions. So there's a couple that are more comments than questions. Greg Charles, his question was sent pretty early at the beginning of the talk. What about /32 or /128 for much finer granularity? Is it possible to express that?
Yeah, it's a great question. This was a sort of, with our initial design, we considered something like this, but we were really concerned about, a server having to do so much work, and we really wanted to make it lightweight and say, hey, these are the 2 places where we should go, rather than sort of dancing around and saying which one has it. There's a lot of, in our initial specification, there was like a lot of dancing around that I had to do, jumping around to find out which one was which. So could you? Sure. But with the way we proposed it, we decided to stick to a couple different places for simplicity.
Okay, thank you.
We can talk more offline if you have more questions there.
Peter van Dijk is asking, or more commenting, I'm afraid this protocol will cause home users of the type that sometimes type dig commands will become second-class internet citizens. The specific steps allow the query, then queue a policy lookup will make things even more confusing to debug for such users. And yes, I can actually extend this to a question. Are there any considerations to support clients like this, or even roaming clients with changing IPs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something we haven't completely considered. Although, I will mention that at least the latest version of Dig, for example, uses cookies by default, and so potentially, I know you just use that as an example, but these tools are becoming more advanced to include things like that. So you're right, but that would be a potential conflict, and could potentially make things a little bit trickier. And I haven't given much more thought to it than that, other than that the client would have to behave at the same level that a recursive server would, given I should more importantly say, given that a policy for that given IP address space, whatever that might be.
Okay, thank you.
We can take, and thanks for that great comment.
Michael Sandberg asks or comments again, as an operator of authoritative server, I would like our software to introduce some sort of state cache for what subnets has what status related to how to allow queries.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And if it's anything like we talked about like I mentioned at the talk, then of course that would be the idea. You'd want to cache as much as possible with enough flexibility that if something changed, you could fold back. But I don't know what to say much more about it than that. I think it's a great comment. It certainly makes things more efficient. The implementers will have a better idea of how to make that efficient than I will, not being an authoritative server vendor.
Okay, John Todd is asking 2 questions. Is there any thought to having a way to distinguish authoritative and recursive egress traffic in your records? And what is the incentive for address owners to register anything at all? And is that the incentive sufficient to drive enough adoption to make this idea useful? Okay,
can you leave the question up too, if you would?
Yes.
Yeah, that's okay for this one. So, John, I actually hadn't thought about that, the authoritative and recursive side. I'll have to give that some more thought, and maybe that's something we could talk about offline to see, where else this could go. But let me answer your second one. This is actually the most important point of this model. Other incentive models are sort of difficult because it's difficult for the client to have any leverage anywhere. Let me give you a quick example. So BCP 38 is wonderful, and we expect people to do it, but there is very little incentive for people to deploy that one because it doesn't benefit the network that's deploying it. That's where the attackers live effectively, these compromised machines that would send out the queries to initiate the DDoS reflection attack. But in this case, it's the victims that are doing it, potentially protecting themselves. So we'd actually expect that since the tables are turned and the natural incentive is I want to protect myself, and this model is unique in that aspect because of that. And so the servers, might require, they're sort of the secondary who might benefit from this secondarily, but we expect the victims would want to do this actually. So, but let's take the first question offline I probably need a little bit more context and discussion on that one. Thanks so much for the question.
Yeah, so we have quite a lot of questions here, actually. I'm sure we won't be able to answer them all. Let's take a few more. David Feldman is asking, an attacker would be able to determine if a server was implementing the protection? No. If so, if only 30% of the servers implemented the protection, the attackers have 70% of available servers to move to. It seems like it might reduce it initially until the attackers change their attack.
So you're saying, let's see, an attacker would be able to determine if the server, I'm trying to process this. I mean, yes, anyone could determine what sort of level of protection someone else could use, just like SPF has done today. 30% of servers implement the protection. The attackers have 70% of available servers to move to. Potentially, yeah. But part of the thing is what we've seen in the past in attacks, and I don't have any numbers in front of me, but I know there's previous work in this, is that attackers don't just pick any server. They'll look for server with large response sizes, something DNS signed, something that has high bandwidth so they can really have a large impact. So you're right. If all servers were created equally, you could just move right over. But the idea is if we can get the big names to implement this, the most vulnerable servers in terms of their response sizes, we feel that could really make a larger impact. So sort of on a more biased level as opposed to a even playing field level, if that makes sense. And we can take that one offline too. It's a great question.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Casey. We have 6 more questions. They're all like related. It's always about adoption. So I will post these questions into the workshop channel. You can you can answer the questions there for people who asked. And thank you again very much for this interesting presentation and this interesting protocol proposal. And we should move to the next presentation in sake of time. So our next speaker is Shuai from Old Dominion University, and his presentation is called Measurement-Based Investigation of DNS Hijacking. So Shuai, you should be ready to go. I can see your screen, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So hello everyone, here I'm going to present our study, a measurement-based investigation of DNS hijacking. This talk is based on our recent published paper, a joint work with the researchers from Palo Alto Networks, UC Irvine, University of Delaware, and Virginia Tech. So I'm currently an assistant professor of computer science at the Old Dominion University. Before that, I was a postdoc in CADA at UC San Diego. So my research interests generally lie in internet and its security issues with a focus on measuring and understanding the internet infrastructure and vulnerabilities. So in today's talk, we will start with some background, then discuss our measurement of domain hijacking attacks. We will then briefly discuss our experiments in detecting those domain hijacking, then wrap up with the discussion and conclusion. So generally, the DNS-related hijacking attacks could be achieved with different forms, including spoofing or intercepting the valid responses, which all resulting in the victims being redirected to the malicious web services. We are particularly interested on a domain hijacking case where the attacker is able to change the record by compromising the target domain owner's account with a third party, such as a registrar or DNS management services, to gain control of the DNS resolution for a domain. So this type of hijacking is common and could cause more serious damage than others. The well-known instances include the Angular, the Spammy Bear, and the C-Turbo domain hijacking campaign. The Angular attack used thousands of hijacked domains to distribute malware. And the Spammy Bear attack leveraged hijacked domains to send spam emails, including bomb threats that lead to multiple building evacuation. And the C-Turbo was a nationwide attack campaign that targeted several governments as well as some private organizations. The goal of our study is to conduct a comprehensive analysis based on the confirmed DNS hijacking event to characterize the DNS hijacking attack and to identify features for potential defense or monitoring mechanism. This leads our study to leverage the passive DNS database to perform the measurement analysis on the captured DNS information that related to this known DNS hijacking. So the passive DNS is used to capture and store the DNS response, where the sensors deployed in global distributed network collected DNS responses between recursive resolvers and the authoritative name servers, extract the relevant fields and store this information in their database for further analysis. So for our measurement, we use the most popular passive DNS dataset from Farsight Security. Again, the data is collected, taken from a global network of sensors and from the zone files. The data has been collected for over 10 years and contain over 130 billion set of records. For the passive DNS database, the fields we are most interested are illustrated here. The first three fields are taken directly from the captured DNS response, indicating the name and the types of the requested resources, as well as the data from the responses. The next three fields are added by the tool creating the DNS database, including the first and the last seen timestamps, and the count, which indicates the total number of times these responses was seen in the input. We first manually identify the DNS hijacking events from different sources, including the news, the tech blogs, and the academic papers. And finally, we obtain 34 such instances. Next, for the passive DNS database, we retrieved the indicator of compromise, for short IOCs, for the evidence of the attacks, including the fully qualified domain names known to be targeted in this hijacking, as well as the name servers and the IP addresses used by the attackers. We use the passive DNS data to examine different characteristics of the attack, including attacker infrastructure, the new qualified domain names associated with the hijacking domain, and the types of records that attacker changed. So first, we examine the infrastructure used by the attackers, including the AS and the hosting services, but there's no particular pattern is useful for identify such attacks. One interesting pattern is that the attackers are using the same machine to host both their malicious name servers and the web server. We observe this in different attacks, especially in the C-turbo hijacking campaign. In this example, we can see record both the malicious name servers and hijacked domains are resolved to the same IP addresses during the attack. Unfortunately, although we do see this pattern is much common in the attacks than the normal cases, but still is not sufficiently used as a strong indicator of malicious activities because it's also common in many deployment of small business. Next interesting pattern is the new fully qualified domain names queried in the A record for a domain. So as an example, suppose here the demo.example.net has a CNAME record pointing to the example.com. And assume an attacker can only hijack the example.net. The attacker cannot control of the traffic associated with the demo.example.net if the CNAME record stay in place. So instead, the attacker can maintain this control by placing an A record containing the IP addresses of its own server. So we found this behavior was sufficiently common that we would consider is worth examining when trying to detect the domain hijacking. So for example, in the attack hijacking the quark list in 2014, we observe a significantly higher number of new RR names, mostly caused by the wildcard age record created by the attackers. So
this is your timekeeper. You have 3 minutes to Q&A.
okay. So well, the final goal in hijacking is to redirect the user to new name servers, which generally involve change to a record. In many of the DNS hijackings, we noted that different multiple record types were changed. Here we can see most attacks tend to manifest themselves in change to multiple record type. One of the most interesting observations from this table is that the change of NS record with the attack. Generally, the change in NS is relatively rare, so this behavior is expected, but it could be a promising approach in recognizing potential domain hijacking activities. So having gained some insight into the domain hijacking attack, we want to test those insights, use those observations for domain hijacking detection. So in our experiments, we replayed the passive DNS data through the system and used the time step to determine what order record should appear. And in our design, an instance is extracted out the new record seen for a given domain or given day. So the status of this group of new record are extracted and then compared to the statistics on previous day in order to obtain those features. For the experiments, we use passive DNS data for several domains, in addition to those known to have been hijacked. So we also retrieve data for Alex top domains as well as the domains in categories and in the business, the domains in our study of hijacked domains. So for the classification, we test two fundamental classifiers, the random forest and the SVM. We divided the dataset by the years for each attack campaign occurred in our dataset. For the result, the false positive rate are very low as expected, but the recall is somewhat high because the length of the attack campaign is relatively long, so it introduces some noise for the detection. This brings us to the final discussion of our work. So first, the passive DNS data was went for but it allowed us to work with the data for real attacks, but it does not allow us to see how well our approach to detection, the hijacking work in real time. So understanding this would require further testing in the live environment. So an interesting further direction is that we could leverage the real DNS traces collected from the security products deployed in global enterprise networks from our industry partners. And another direction is to explore more active probables to augment the detection when passive analysis promotes some alerts for potential DNS hijacking. Finally, to conclude, this study illustrates our preliminary effort for characterizing the domain hijacking and exploring the potential detection. So the changes in DNS response do provide some key indicators about domain hijacking event. So the information could be leveraged to build a lightweight filter based on the passively collected data. And the authoritative name server in particular provides some important insights, and developing some more advanced features could be useful to improve the detection of domain hijacking. So thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. We haven't received any question yet. If you have questions, please send them in, or raise your hand, and you will be allowed to ask verbally. In the meantime, again, a poll should pop up on your screen, and please provide feedback to the program committee and also to the speaker. We are running a little bit late, but I will allow a minute or so if anyone has a question. I don't see any raised hand. And I don't see any incoming questions. So, okay, thank you again. If our attendees have questions, please post them into the workshop channel on Mothermost. I'm sure Shuai will be able to answer there. Thank you again for the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
And our next presentation, which is actually the last presentation from the program committee, or selected by the program committee, is a presentation by Rafael Elvira from Slack. And he will talk about the recent Slack outage in his presentation titled Slack's DNSSEC Rollout, the third time's the outage. So Rafael.
John, can you hear me well?
I can hear you well, you're good to go.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about Slack's DNSSEC rollout and the outage that we had on September 30th. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Raffaele Elvira, and I'm a senior software engineer on the traffic team at Slack. Our team looks after ingress load balancing, TLS and SSL, DNS, CDN, and DDoS protection at Slack, among other things. And during this talk, I'm going to pretend to be a DNS expert, but that's something I'm clearly not. So yeah, let's go. So what's DNSSEC? DNSSEC is a suite of extensions intended for securing data exchanged by the DNS protocol. The protocol provides cryptographic authentication of data, authenticated denial of existence, and data integrity, but not availability or confidentiality. These are the record and key types used by DNSSEC, which I will be referencing to later on. So first, the DS record. This is the delegation signer used to secure delegations between name servers, also referenced as the chain of trust. The DNS key record holds a public key that resolvers can use to verify the DNSSEC signatures in RRSEC records. And this RRSEC record holds a DNSSEC signature for a record set, which resolvers can verify the signature with a public key stored in a DNS key record. The NSEC or NSEC3 records can be used by resolvers to verify the non-existence of a record name and type. And then in terms of keys, we have the zone signing key, which is the private portion of the key, which digitally signs each record set in the zone, while the public portion, the DNS key, verifies the signature. The key signing key signs the public key, which is the DNS key record, creating an RRSEC for the DNS key specifically. Here's a successful DNS record request sequence where the user will make a request to the recursive resolver, and then this recursive resolver will then attempt to track down the DNS record. It does this by making a series of requests until it reaches the authoritative DNS name server for the requested record, which is slack.com in this case. So this is a very basic interpretation of a DNS record request. The sequence is the same when the resolver does DNSSEC validation, and the only difference being the additional records requested and returned to perform said validation. We should keep in mind that DNSSEC only validates the DNS responses received by the recursive resolver, the requests have not been tampered with in transit, and is legitimately what the authoritative name server has in the zone. So bad actors can still man in the middle between the recursive resolver and the end user, as shown in this slide. So yeah, now that we've briefly touched base on DNSSEC, let's go through our DNSSEC journey at Slack. Back in May, we started off by doing a proof of concept where we replicated most of our DNS use cases on a controlled and isolated environment. And in this environment, we carried multiple tests where we gained knowledge on how to operate DNSSEC. Once our proof of concept was successfully completed, we worked on an internal RFC that outlined all the necessary work to enable DNSSEC signing on all Slack domains. Then, prior to enabling DNSSEC signing on any of our domains, we spent significant time simplifying our DNS setup and making necessary some changes in preparation for DNSSEC. I won't be talking about this today, but feel free to reach out after the talk if you're interested in any of this. So then once we deemed our zones to be ready for DNSSEC, we started with the actual rollout plan, which, by design, DNSSEC can only be enabled on a per domain basis, making it impossible to enable DNSSEC per subdomain or subzone of a given domain. So this design choice significantly increases the risk of any DNSSEC rollouts. So to overcome this, we categorized our domains by the risk, low, medium, and high. And in this way, in the case of failed attempt or any bugs in early stages, we would only impact domains that are used for like monitoring or other non-critical or less impactful Slack features. For each of those domains, we followed the same extensive testing and validation steps, making sure all our domains were still resolving correctly after the DNSSEC signing was enabled. So you must be thinking, but how did it all go wrong after all this? So as you might have guessed, slack.com was the last domain on our DNSSEC rollout. And prior to doing slack.com, we rolled out DNSSEC to all other Slack public domains successfully with no internal or customer impact. But obviously, slack.com had to be different. So in this section, we're going to cover the 3 times that we failed to roll out DNSSEC signing to slack.com. On September 7th, we did our first attempt to enable DNSSEC signing on slack.com. However, prior to publishing the slack.com DS record at the registrar, a large ISP in the US had an outage, and many of our customers reported being unable to access Slack as a result. So early in that incident, before we even were aware of the ISP issue, the slack.com zone changes were rolled back as a precaution. One day later, on September 7th, we enabled DNSSEC signing on slack.com following the same procedure as on a previous attempt. And then prior to publishing the DS record again, our customer experience team noticed a small number of users reporting DNS resolution problems. So we decided to stop there, and we started an investigation and realized most of the affected users were accessing Slack through a VPN provider. And then once again, we decided to roll back signing on the slack.com zone as a precaution. So in this case, it turned out that some resolvers become more strict when DNSSEC signing is enabled at the authoritative name servers, even before the DS records were published to the .com name servers. So this strict DNSSEC enforcement will reject the CNAME record at the apex of a zone, including the apex of a subdelegated zone, which was our case. So this was the reason that customers using VPN providers were disproportionately affected. And many VPN providers use resolvers with this behavior. So to overcome this problem, all our subdelegated zones were updated to alias records. So then after migrating all these CNAMEs at the apex of subzones to alias, we were ready for another attempt. So then on September 30th, and after a careful planning, we made our 3rd attempt to enable DNSSEC signing on slack.com. So we first enabled signing on the authoritative name server and the delegated subzones, leaving a soak time in between prior to publishing the DS record at the registrar, as we had seen issues on the other 2 previous attempts. And then after a 3-hour soak time and successful validations, we were confident to publish the slack.com DS record at the registrar, which instructed resolvers to start validating DNS requests for slack.com. At this point, we had fully enabled DNSSEC signing for slack.com. Everything looked great for a while. All our tests, external probes, and monitoring were successful, and we were really happy to have gotten this far in the rollout. But then, short while later, things started to look a little less idyllic. So then our customer experience team started getting reports from users seeing DNS resolution errors in their Slack clients. And to give you some context, Slack applications are based on Chromium and integrate a way to export the netlog capture. Netlog is an event logging mechanism for Chrome's network stack and will help you debug problems and analyze performance. Netlogs are extensively used at Slack by engineering and customer experience team. So on the left on this slide, you will find the DNS configuration of a client available inside the netlog capture. And on the right, you can see an attempt to resolve app.slack.com with all the relevant information. During our initial investigation, all reports were caused by no data, empty DNS responses from some DNS recursive resolvers, most of which were from a large customer using a private corporate DNS resolver and Google public resolver as well, which is Quad 8. So we were both surprised and kind of confused by this. as Google DNS failing to resolve Slack.com should mean a much larger impact that our monitoring and customer reports indicated. So given the data we had at the time, we decided to roll back our changes for Slack.com. We did so by attempting to pulling the DS record from the DNS registrar, effectively removing the Slack.com DS record at the .com zone. This is our way to stop the bleeding, so we could later focus on the no data DNS responses reported by customers. So after nearly an hour, there were no signs of improvement and error rates remained stable. Then our traffic team was, we were confident that reverting the DS record published in the registrar was sufficient to eventually resolve the DNS resolution problems. But as things were not getting any better, and given the severity of the incident, we decided to roll back one step further, which is we rolled back DNSSEC signing on our Slack.com authoritative and delegated zones, wanting to recover our DNS configuration to the last previous healthy state, which we hoped would allow us to completely rule out DNSSEC as a problem. And then as soon as the rollback was pushed out, things got much worse. So our traffic team was paged due to DNSSEC resolution issues for Slack.com from multiple resolvers and probes around the world. So yeah, our understanding at the time was that, we expected that DS records at the .com zone were never cached. So pulling it from the registrar would cause resolvers to immediately stop performing DNSSEC validation. This assumption turned out to be somewhat untrue, as the .com zone will ask resolvers to cache the Slack.com DS record for a 24-hour by default. So we knew stop signing the authoritative zone is a high-risk operation unless the DS record is not published anymore. However, the assumption of no cache DS record at the .com zone made us think we were in the same state as in the previous two rollbacks, having the same end results. However, unlike our other previous two attempts, this time some of the resolvers had cached the DS record for up to 24 hours once the rollback was complete. And then at this point, all validating resolvers that had recently cached this DS record for Slack.com started returning serve failed to Slack.com lookups. We quickly realized the mistake we had just made, and we started contacting major ISPs and operators that weren't public DNS resolvers, asking them to flush all the cache records for Slack.com. Additionally, we proactively flushed caches for resolvers that offer a public site like Google's Quad 8 or Cloudflare's Quad 9. And then as resolvers flushed their caches, we slowly saw signs of improvement on our internal monitoring. But yeah, so to give you some context, Slack clients, in terms of monitoring, Slack clients send their telemetry to a different domain called SlackB. And thanks to this isolation that we built between our domains, we were still able to receive all the client metrics that helped us quantify the impact of this outage, which ironically, SlackB is a DNSSEC-enabled domain at this point. So in terms of keys, throughout the incident, we considered resigning the Slack.com zone without publishing again the DS record, as restoring would slightly improve the situation for some users, but it wouldn't have solved the issues with all the users that were initially getting the no data responses after signing was enabled. So for us to restore signing, we would have had to recover the key signing key that had been deleted when we rolled back the changes to the Slack.com zone. In RAW53, which is our authoritative name server, the KSK, key signing key, is managed via an AWS KMS key. This KMS key is recoverable as per configuration, meaning that the key signing key will be the same after the recovery, but we were uncertain if the zone signing key would have been the same or different, as the zone signing key is fully managed by RAW53 internally, and we have no visibility into that. After the incident, the Amazon RAW53 team confirmed that the zone signing key would have been different. And when re-enabling signing on a zone, the zone signing key will be generated with a new key pair, meaning that all DNSSEC validating resolvers will have continued failing to validate. So we decided not to restore signing due to a lack of confidence. And we now know it wouldn't have helped at all for us. So at this point, and some hours into the incident, we were in a situation where Slack was resolving correctly for the vast majority of customers, but a long tail of users of smaller DNS resolvers, which had not flushed their Slack.com records, were still impacted. Then as public resolvers caches were flushed and the 24-hour TTL record on Slack.com expired, the error rates went back to normal. So at this point, all we had left was a mystery to solve. So once the impact to Slack customers was mitigated, we aimed to determine the root cause of this outage. And prior to attempting DNSSEC on Slack.com again, our team had successfully enabled DNSSEC on all other Slack public domains. So we kind of had a lot of questions like, so how is Slack.com different to all the other domains, and why did we didn't see any issues on any of the other previous domains, and why did it only impact some corporate internal DNS resolvers and some of Google public DNS, but not all? So yeah, to understand this and what happened, we replicated the rollout steps using a test zone setup identical to Slack.com and used a resolver that we had problems during the rollout. Surprisingly, all our attempts to reproduce the behavior were unsuccessful. So at this point, we decide to, okay, let's go back to the net logs that we had received from many of our customers during the outage, and let's take a look at them. And this is where we found an extremely interesting clue. Clients were able to resolve Slack.com successfully, but failed to resolve app.slack.com. So why? This indicated that there was likely a problem with the start.slack.com wildcard record, since we didn't have a wildcard record in any of the other domains where we had rolled out DNSSEC on. So this was clearly an oversight. And we did not test a domain that had a wildcard record before attempting slack.com. So we collected all the evidence we could and reached out to the Amazon Raf53 team, who jumped on a call with us to figure it out. And after walking them through the evidence we had, they quickly correlated this behavior to an issue with NSEC responses that Raf53 generated on wildcard records. So basically, when a request is made to a DNSSEC-enabled domain for a wildcard record which type does not exist, for example, a quad A record for an IPv6 address, the answer is a signed NSEC record confirming that while the domain name exists, the requested type does not. This signed NSEC record response can include some additional information specifically designed to not break wildcard records, but Raf53 was not returning this additional information. What this means is that a request for a record at the same level, say a quad A lookup for app.slack.com, would correctly return a signed NSEC saying there is no record for that. And this is correct since we don't publish any quad A records. But then the expected client behavior is to fall back to requesting an A record. But since Raf53 isn't returning that extra information, some public resolvers, including Google Public DNS, will take that response to mean no other record type exists for that record name. So there is no need to query for an A record. So this NSEC response is cached, which effectively meant that impacted DNS resolvers were unintentionally being cache poisoned by clients innocently checking for the existence of quad A records when DNSSEC was enabled on this Raf53 zone with a wildcard record. So luckily, this cache poisoning would only affect the regional cache of some of the resolvers, meaning that one regional cache of a larger impacted resolver could be temporarily poisoned, and anyone else hitting that same cache would see the failure, but those hitting other regional caches on the same resolver would not, unless they did a quad A lookup. Interestingly, we were able to reproduce this issue with one of our test zones against Google Public DNS, but not against Cloudflare Public DNS, for example, or other resolvers. So we had a second mystery that, which was whether or not one of these major public resolvers was out of spec, possibly. So we investigated this and found out that it is protocol compliant to reuse a cached NSEC record to decide a subsequent response. And in fact, that's what aggressive NSEC does. But this is an optional spec, which Google implements, but others not. So in the end, we concluded that both options were acceptable. And the only real way to avoid being in this ambiguous situation is for our authoritative name server to correctly return existing record types in the NSEC type bitmap. So at this point, our mystery was finally solved. And at the time of the writing this talk, the Raf53 team has rolled out a fix to the NSEC type bug, which is described above. So, we are very sorry for the impact this outage had on everyone who uses Slack, and we hope that this talk will shed some light on some of the corner cases with DNSSEC, and maybe, just maybe, we will prevent someone else from having the similar issue or committing the same mistakes. So before we jump into a bit of a Q&A, I would like to do some acknowledgements. I would like to thank the Amazon RAP53 team for their collaboration and for the rapid fix, the Salesforce public DNS team for their kindness, their support, and their DNSSEC expertise, and as well all of the DNS community for their invaluable help in rapidly flushing caches, trying to bring Slack back to everyone affected by this problem. And last but not least, really huge thank you to our customer experience team, who are the ones in the front lines every day, connecting the dots between customers and our engineering teams. And we couldn't have done it without them. So yeah, that's it. Feel free to go ahead and read a more detailed write-up about this in our engineering blog. It's over at slack.engineering, and I am now ready to take any answers you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. That was really exciting, and thank you for going through all the details and the whole story with us. So we have quite a lot of questions here, so I'll just start reading them out. Hazel Smith is asking, what was the TTL on your DS records?
So the TTL on the DS record is not mandated by us. It's we publish the DS record via our DNS registrar, which in our case is Mark Monitor. Then Mark Monitor takes that and publishes it to the .com zone. So the TTL of the DS record is managed by the .com zone owner, which I think it's VeriSign. So we don't have any means to actually modify the TTL or have it be lower and in the case of the rollout and then increase it. So we do not have the means to touch that.
Okay, thank you. I will also remind everyone to rate this presentation. There should be a poll already showing up on your screens, so please do that so the PC has some information about which talks you like next time. You might like next time. The next comment is by Peter Lexis. Thanks for sharing this horror story. I can imagine the stress you had that day. And now the question, when do you expect to sign Slack.com again? And will you then update or make a new blog about how easy it was eventually?
Yeah, so thank you, Peter. We expect to enable DNSSEC signing on Slack.com again. I do not have, or I cannot share the date with you yet. So we are planning on a new draft to enable DNSSEC signing again on Slack.com. Most of our work is done after this. The RAP53 bug is solved at this point. So I'm not sure if we will update the blog post or make a new one. It depends on if we have a nice story to tell, or if it will be a kind of a boring thing. But I am considering keeping the DNS-OARC community in the loop when we enable DNSSEC. So we have all this great community. Take a look at it while we do it, and report back anything that they might be seeing on their DNS resolvers.
Thank you. And the next question will be asked by Anand Buddhadev, and he will actually ask the question by himself. So Anand, you should be able to speak.
Hello, Jan. Thank you very much. This is more of a comment rather than a question. Rafael's presentation about this outage reminded me of one issue that I've been thinking about, which is high values of TTL on the DS records. These days, most registries set very high TTLs on DS records, including CommonNet, which have 1 day. And I think that low TTLs on DS records would really help. And in fact, I have just sent an email this afternoon to the RIPE DNS working group mailing list, proposing to lower the DS record TTL to 1 hour in the reverse DNS tree maintained by RIPE NCC. Thanks.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you for the comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, we have a few more questions and we have quite a lot of time. So next comment or question, or is a question. Brian Dickinson is asking, how many real records are necessary at the apex of Slack versus below the apex? Would delegating all non-apex names and starting slow with insecure delegations be something you have considered for the next attempt? Not sure if you have already deployed.
Yeah, well, so most of them are necessary at the apex. I would say we only have a few delegation or records that we delegate. I think, testing and validation was mostly fine. The only problem was, actually enabling DNSSEC signing and getting like that weird NSEC bug in RAW 53. So I'm not sure how much it helped us. It's definitely a good idea and something that we can investigate. So yeah, appreciate your comment, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Peter van Dijk is adding another comment. The DNS key TTL was only 1 hour, so a new zone signing key would start working after an hour. Of course, you would still be stuck with the no data NSEC issue with Google and that enterprise customer then, which I suspect could be solvable with Google at least.
Yeah, so that's a fair point, Peter. There's a bit more context about this on the blog post, I think. But at that point, we were not confident. So we were not entirely sure like how, in terms of the DS record TTL, like how responsible we were for those. And if at the time of enabling the signing on the zone, that had something to do with the TTL of the DS record. So we were not confident at all, like reverting the incident to a state where, we need to go back and ask all the ISPs and all the operators to flush again, because we did a mistake again. So at this point, rather than going after the hours in the incident that we were, we decided to continue with our plan of, okay, let's finish the flushes that we have left. We only have a few hours until the TTL expires, and let's investigate that line of work for future outages if any happen. But that is a very good point, Peter.
And Peter actually dropped another comment. Yes, I understand how this is easy in hindsight. You had a tough call to make. So thank you, Peter. And a few more questions. Panitsud is asking what testing you adding to catch problems like this in the future? Yeah, so not a lot is changing in terms of testing. I think our testing was pretty good. The only thing that we didn't do, and it's ultimately could have caught this problem, is in DNSVis, which is a tool to run like DNS tests and DNSSEC tests. There's a check for like non-existence records, and that definitely caught the RAW 53 bug, but we were unaware of that option in DNSVis. So that's definitely a lesson learned for us, and something that changed in our testing in our runbooks. What else? I don't think that much is changing, other than we now have a written down process and runbooks in terms of like, okay, how can we restore the keys and all the risks of each step and how to revert from each step, so we don't like make the same mistakes as we did in the past. But not a lot of like new learnings in terms of like testing cases that we have learned so far, I would say. Okay, thank you. Peter Koch is asking, are you using DNSSEC validating resolvers internally in production? So I think this means if our own infrastructure uses validating resolvers, and the answer is no, as far as I know. This is coming from a FedRAMP moderate requirement, and very important customers that require this feature to be enabled. So it's not something that we wanted for our infrastructure internally, but more as a customer-facing kind of thing. Yeah, this only applied to like Slack public domains and not the internal ones managed by us. Okay, thank you. Alison Mankin is adding a comment or question. I believe that we, Salesforce Public DNS, have found another example of no data NSEC issue in a different and uncommon stack. Do we think we need to clarify the specification, or rather should the IETF clarify the specification? Well, I think that's a very good question, Alison, but something that I definitely don't have the knowledge about. Yeah, I think. But yeah, good food for thought for the community, and yes. Yeah, I think so. So I don't see any more questions in Zoom. I do see a lot of people typing in the workshop channel on Mattermost though, so you definitely check what has been written there, Rafael. And thank you again for your presentation. And yeah, and for the PC, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would like to thank all speakers. I would like to thank everyone who asked their questions. And with that, I will hand it over to Keith for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jan, for chairing today's session, and Ulrich for timekeeping, and to all our speakers for a great selection of talks. Just a quick couple of updates from me before we move on to the social. We're once again using spatial chat. I was lucky enough to be able to attend an actual in-person meeting and social last week. So I know it's not the same, but it'd be great to see you there, hang out for an hour or so after today's proceedings. You should have received the password via your registration email for joining the spatial chat. And yeah, you get, it's not like Zoom, you get to move your little video window around. But anyway, you know, we're hopefully we'll be able to do some in-person socials in 2022. Survey reminder for general feedback. Thank you all for the responses to the speakers today. That's really good data that we've got for the program committee for future meetings. If you have more general feedback on the event, there's the URL there. So we resume at 10 a.m. UTC tomorrow, so a number of hours earlier than we did today. And yes, for those of you on my side of the Atlantic, that will be a little bit early, but we'd appreciate you joining us then. That covers it for today. See you in the social room shortly.